When I finished my secondary school education at Ballarat High School, I couldn't work out what I was going to do or be. I went fruit picking for 6 weeks up at Mildura and then came home and I got a job in a factory for a little while, and then a mate of mine who was working for a builder said, "Hey Peter, why don't you come and work for Wally?" So I did, as a builder's labourer. And on one of the jobs, a mate of mine and I had a competition. The competition was to see how many bags of cement we could carry at once. My friend was a bit bigger than me. He was able to carry 3 at a time, one under each arm and one across the shoulders. Well, I don't know if you've ever picked up a bag of cement, but they're pretty heavy. And we were very conscious of the weight we were carrying. The weight, of course, even though we were carrying it, we were very restricted in any of the movements that we could make. The weight was so great that all we could do was stand up and then stagger for the cement mixer. I guess we're all conscious today that we're living in a time when living hurts for many people. The burdens and the demands of modern day living weighs people down. And each day we read in our newspapers, social media, or watch the evening news on television, we're confronted with the pain and the hurt that are in people's lives. Of course, we may not have experienced some of these hurts ourselves, or we may dull their impact on ourselves by making distractions, but we cannot deny that for some people, living literally hurts. In fact, in the Hebrew scriptures, in the book of Job, it states in chapter 5, verse 7, "But human beings are born to trouble, just as sparks fly upwards." And if you've been following the Royal Commission into Mental Health recently, you would have observed that more than 578,000 Victorians sought mental health help through their GP last year. That's over 500,000 people. That's an increase of more than 30% in 4 years. And if you read police statistics, police are responding to mental health call-outs every 12 minutes, with 43,000 events involving a psychiatric crisis or potential suicide last year. 2 out of every 5 students who are seeing their GPs during their high school years need mental health help. And new mental health beds have been delayed from opening, of course, due to shortages of staff. And more than 90% of psychiatrists in Victoria are located in Melbourne and Geelong, which means that it's a postcode lottery for the rest of the state. Associate Professor Ruth Vine, who's leading mental health expert and Executive Director of Northwestern Mental Health, said at the Commission recently that while Victoria's population was exploding, the number of mental health hospital beds has not grown since the 1990s and lagged behind other states. The cost of a mental health bed is about $850 a day, but the demand far exceeds the money that state and federal governments are prepared to invest in them. The Director of Psychiatry at our Alfred Health Hospital here in Melbourne, Associate Professor Simon Starface, told the Commission this week that about a quarter of the more than 5,000 patients who were presenting at the Alfred Hospital each year with mental health disorders were homeless. Gail Bradley works for the Inner West Area Mental Health Service, where she's the manager. She oversees mental health for clients at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, their crisis accommodation centres, Flagstaff and Ozanam House. She tells how more than 200 homeless people, many with mental health issues, are being turned away each night, while the hospital had up to 10 people presenting a night in acute mental health distress. In 2011, 700 people presented at the Royal Melbourne Hospital with mental health or suicidal ideation. By 2015, it had more than doubled to 2,000, and it's presently increasing by 20% each year. So for many people, the most prevalent burden that they live with, of course, is depression and anxiety. Depression has a long and well-known history. And many of the Psalms in the Jewish scriptures reflect this blackness of soul. Why is my soul downcast, the psalmist says. Or do not hide your face from me in the day of my distress. And since the opening of Beyond Blue in Victoria and the Black Dog Institute in Sydney, we have become more aware of this condition and the enormous debilitating effect on everyday life for those who suffer. We also know that many instances of depression and anxiety are masked, hidden behind a host of somatic complaints or other psychological problems. And we also see the effects of depression in people's lives, the suffering, the damaged relationships, the lost work, and the depleted personal time. And allied to depression, of course, is pervasive anxiety. The theologian Paul Tillich argued that there are three forms of anxiety, each one predominant during a specific era. In earlier times, when physical survival was most prominent, human beings were in the grip of ontic anxiety, in other words, worrying about their survival. And during the Middle Ages, anxiety was associated with guilt, and the imagination of ordinary people was fixated on the gruesome pictures and visions of hell. And in the 20th century, we were suffering from an anxiety derived from a sense of meaninglessness in life. And now in this century, the 21st century, we find ourselves intimidated by all of those three forms of anxiety. And because of the presence of these three forms of anxiety, we now find ourselves experiencing a fourth type of anxiety, an anxiety associated with the collapse of hope and consequent failure of nerve. The sense of hopelessness has resulted in a loss of life energy and pervasive fatigue. Over the past few years, through the Royal Commission into Sexual Abuse, particularly with religious institutions, many hundreds of people have suffered from the emotional and sexual abuse as children and carried the scars of that abuse to their grave. In the years that I was a school chaplain, 35 years, I spent many hours listening to parents tell me of their concerns about their children. Some children cause their parents enormous hurts and create huge problems for them as they grapple with drug addiction or substance abuse, rave parties, hooning in their parents' car, worries about career choices, relationship concerns. These are just a few of the concerns that parents often have for their children. And some parents carry the weight and burden of bereavement and grief through losing their child. I'll never forget the emotions over the years as a chaplain being called to comfort a family whose father, daughter, mother or son have prematurely ended their life. When I was chaplain at St Leonard's College, I remember being called out early in the morning because a Year 10 student had walked deliberately into a path of a truck on the Nepean Highway in Moorabbin. Or when I was at Wesley, A Year 10 girl threw herself in front of a train at Gardenvale railway station, and her mother found her daughter's body on the tracks as she'd gone there to meet her daughter, expecting her to get off the train. These are burdens and emotional weights that families carry with them for the rest of their life. So when life hurts, and it sometimes hurts for us all, how do we respond to these burdens and hurts? Well, we can try and handle our hurts within the context of our own resources. We've friends that we can talk to. We have work colleagues in whom we can confide. We can speak with an accepting minister, or we can often, because of shame or guilt, try to carry the burden by ourselves and mask it to those who are closest to us. We can seek help from health professionals, our GP, a counsellor, or a psychologist. But for many people, they forget that there are spiritual resources, and these are the last area to which they turn to find solace and support in helping them to carry the burdens of their hurt. Carl Jung, the great psychologist, reminds us that the telling question of a person's life is their relationship to the infinite. He also wrote in one of his books that there is no problem that he has dealt with in his whole career that was not a spiritual problem. Matthew, in his Gospel, written in the 80s of the first century, put these words into the mouth of Jesus. It's interesting, reading the 5 Gospels from the Jesus Seminar, that the 120-odd scholars believe that this is not a saying of Jesus. However, it is words that you could imagine Jesus saying, because Matthew echoes these words in a passage in the Wisdom of Jesus, son of Sirach, also known as Ecclesiasticus, a treatise composed in the 2nd century before Christ, which is part of the Apocrypha part of the Bible. And this is what it says: "Put your neck under the yoke, and let your souls receive instruction. It is to be found close by. See with your eyes that I have laboured little and found for myself much rest." So both Matthew and the Gospel of Thomas have picked up this theme and attributed it to Jesus. So Jesus issued, through these words, an invitation. "Come to me, all those who are burdened and heavy laden." So there needs to be a decision on our part of the will. If we are more addicted to our sufferings and our hurts and our problems rather than the amelioration of them, then we will not see the possibilities which lie in Jesus' invitation. And there is no discrimination in the invitation. It is all who are heavy laden are welcome. So many people in the time when Jesus lived felt the yoke of many oppressions: religious, political, military, economic. And the yoke which Jesus offered was to give them rest. But how does this rest occur? There's a transfer of yokes. He says, "Take my yoke." Taking his yoke means to walk in the way of the Christ and obey the voice of our inner selves, and you will find that the burdens and the hurts ease and lighten. A little girl listened to the reading from the text, "My yoke is easy," in her Sunday school class. The teacher asked, "Who can tell me what a yoke is?" And the girl answered, "Something they put on the necks of animals." "And what do you think is the meaning of God's yoke?" the Sunday school teacher said. And the little girl thought for a moment and then said, "That is when God puts his arms around your neck." So whether we prefer the term God, divine spirit, or just the word spirit, there is wisdom in what that little girl said. For when living hurts, we need to feel the embrace of the divine spirit to nurture and to sustain us in everyday life. Our blessing. And I'm using this blessing from the words of Bishop John Spong. God is the source of life, so worship God by living. God is the source of love, so worship God by loving. God is the ground of being, so worship God by having the courage to be more fully human, the embodiment of the divine. Amen.